Ok. Oi. O meu som? Gente, como que eu aumento isso? Pessoal, vocês estão vendo esse endereço aqui? 200.17.247.224/transversal. Isso é um link, tá bom? Então, para quem tem colegas que estão no remoto e não estão conseguindo acessar o SIGA, se eles forem na internet, certo? E digitar esse link, eles vão conseguir ter acesso ao vídeo. E daí a aula não vai ser um problema, tá? Então, ó, esse é o link 200.17.247.224/transversal, tá? Você quer colocar isso num editor aqui? Ah, é visitante? Pode ser esse? Tá? Pessoal, então vamos lá. O vídeo tá tudo certo? Tá no ar? Tá? Pessoal, só um aviso, tá? Boa tarde para todos. Hoje é 16 de outubro, tá? Por algum motivo, se você não estiver gostando da disciplina, tá? Hoje é o último dia para vocês trancarem, cancelarem a disciplina, tá bom? Tem que ser feita hoje. Se decidiu cancelar amanhã, já não tem mais volta. Então, quem não estiver gostando da disciplina, hoje é o último dia. Certo? Vamos lá. Como fazer para cancelar a disciplina? Vocês têm que ir no SIGA, tá? Eu sei que está fora do ar, mas tem que ir no SIGA. Voltou, tá? O SIGA voltou. Vocês vão no SIGA, aí na barra à esquerda tem uma parte que está escrito assim, disciplinas. Aí lá vai estar dizendo que vocês estão matriculados em Escrita Acadêmica, tá? E aí tem um botão lá que é desistir da disciplina, ou algo desse tipo, tá? Quem tem que fazer o cancelamento da disciplina são vocês próprios no sistema do SIGA. Não adianta mandar e-mail pedindo cancelamento. Esse processo é feito pelo aluno no SIGA, tá bom? Eu vou reforçar o comunicado ao final da aula, tá? Tudo certo, Apolinário?
How's the sound? Sound okay? All right, welcome everybody. And today we're talking about discussing things. Discussion. And you know, discussion is not discussed enough. And it should be, because it's one of the things that can contribute to rejection of an article. And it's, in the context of Brazil, it's even a bit surprising that people have problems with discussion, because Brazilians seem to love discussion so much. You have, what do you call it, DR? DR, no discutir a relação, something like that. Yeah, yeah. It's a reality. We don't have a translation for that, but it happens. But it seems to happen so commonly here that there's a term for it. And Brazilians love to discuss, it seems. So it seemed that in an article, you'd have more discussion. I love the fact that Brazilians like to discuss things. It's nice. You know, I always joke that you really notice that difference when it's someone's birthday, for example. So, you know, as Americans will just say to a person whose birthday it is, say, happy birthday, and that's it. But here, there's like this whole sonnet that is recited that, you know, parabéns, muita saúde, muita paz, muito amor, que continue essa pessoa linda que você é, all that. It's great. I love that. I don't know if you ever noticed in American movies when people hang up the phone, they kind of just say bye, and that's it. And here, you know, they're constantly, in Brazil, they're kind of saying goodbye and a lot of goodbyes. And even when the hellos happen, I'm constantly policing myself because when I send a WhatsApp message, for example, I just go straight to the point usually. You know, do this, do that. Don't forget this, don't forget that. But I constantly find myself erasing what I just wrote and then first saying bom dia to the bem, and then getting to the point because, you know, that phatic part of the relationship you have with people is really important. You need to discuss things. Another time that seems to happen is in New Year's. New Year's is amazing. Again, as an American, I'll generally say Happy New Year, and that's it. Maybe on January 2nd, and then it stops. Here, I don't know when I have to stop saying Happy New Year to people when I see them the first time when the New Year happens, and when they say Happy New Year to me, it's like this long thing. I love it. It's great. Feliz Ano Novo, muito sucesso, muito paz, muito amor, muita felicidade para você, seu filho, sua tia, sua avó, everything. And I love that. That's great. So we think that, you know, when it comes to discussing things, it's strange that when I receive research articles that often, even Brazilians, suddenly change. Their discussion is really short. And usually, as you'll see later on, it's just a recap of factual information instead of discussing the results. So today we're really talking about what is the importance of this discussion of results. To situate today's discussion, here we are on the 16th of October, as Callie pointed out. And you have exactly 7 days from today to complete your feedback of articles. You will each have 2 articles to give feedback on. And then after that, starting after next week, basically, but you can already start today, you should start thinking about your final article. Now, that doesn't mean you have to turn in your final article soon, but you should start drafting it. And so you will have a chance on the 11th, rather the 6th of November, to turn in a draft of an article. And I know that seems like really, really soon, and it kind of really is. It's right around the corner. But it's kind of also a way to force you to really move forward in your article. Don't worry, no matter what phase of writing that you're in, no matter what phase of data collection that you're in, whether you have data or not, you will be able to turn in a draft on that date. Then on the 13th, we go on to do something different, but you'll still have time to write. And then on the 20th, you'll have to turn in feedback to each other. So you're going to have at least 2 moments of feedback on your writing, including the introduction and then your first draft article, before you have to turn in your final article. And that will be on the 18th is your basically your due date, because at that date, at the latest, you'll have to turn in your article to your orientadores, your advisors, and they will give you feedback on that. And then they will have to give the feedback back to us by that date, on the 29th of January next year. When we get closer to that date, I will be sending here this form for them to look at, and they will have to, your orientadores, your advisors will have to give you feedback on specific elements of your article. If you are not a student, if you're a professor here at the university, or universities that are also part of this class, you can rate yourself, or you can, sumindo o som. Okay, okay. The feedback that you're going to receive from your advisors are basically based on the same sort of criteria that you would see from a typical journal. And you've seen these criteria before. The criteria that are related to, does the article show what is significant, the contribution of the study? Does the paper show a clear methodology? And then one of the most important things for today's, as far as today's concerned, is are the interpretations of your findings and the conclusions, are they justified by the results when there are results? Not all papers have results, but if there are results, are the interpretations or the conclusions justified? And that's a key point for today. So today we're going to have a quick overview of a reminder of what we talked about with introductions, because we're going to introductions to method and method discussions today, and then focus more on the discussion section. As a reminder, you will have received an email from PeerGrade, the feedback opened on the 9th of October, that was Wednesday last week, and it will close on the 23rd. After that date, after 11:59 p.m., it's out of my hands, and you will not have a complete grade if you turn in your paper after that time. So please do turn it in by that date and that time. About 50% of the people have done so already. You will have received an email that looks like this. Peer review is open. So if you haven't received it for some reason, check your spam folders or your junk folders or whatever. And the content of this email looks like this. Peer review is open. Hi, so-and-so. Peer review is now open for the assignment Introduction 2019 in the class of Academic Writing 2019. Click the button below. And when you click that button, you will be taken to 2 feedback forms that you'll have to fill out after you read the introductions. Introductions have been nicely short, so it shouldn't take too long. And then after you do that, you have this assignment on formative, which is to simply talk about the feedback experience. Did you like it? Didn't like it? What did you like about it? What did you not like about it? Okay, so last class, let me take you back to this. Do you remember we talked about, I showed you a video of a kind of pseudo experiment with these deodorants, in which a young woman filled the armpits of 4 different men. Actually, a total of 8 different armpits. And I wrote a fictional account, a fictional method for this. And the method I wrote, just as a reminder, was this. Men were chosen for the experiment. After playing basketball, each man applied 2 different deodorants, 1 on each armpit. A young woman was recruited to judge how pleasing the smell of each deodorant was. The female judge smelled each armpit, each time noting her impressions. Her final analysis was then given based on the notes taken. We all agreed that this method was very poor. It didn't tell enough information. And it's almost like the inverse situation of what happens in the introduction section. So, as I've said before, one of the problems that happens, one of the causes of a problem that can happen is when somebody has spent 2 to 4 years working on a particular research project, trying to fit too much information into the introduction section to the point where the things don't connect very well, or there's unnecessary information there. Whereas in the method section, the opposite sometimes happens, where there's not enough information, simply because maybe a lot of the assumptions that you have are not put in there because it's in your head. You've thought about it so long, maybe it seems obvious to you that you forget to include particular information. So I asked you to read this method as if you were a reviewer of a journal article. And a lot of you raised questions like the kind that a journal editor or journal reviewer would raise, and you put these on formative. And you raise all kinds of interesting points, everything from, does hair come into the equation, to maybe she was even related or was a girlfriend of one of the guys there, all kinds of different variables that could cause problems for the results. And here are just a selection of a few that I pulled out from your comments. So, were the ages of the men, quanto tempo ela permanecia avaliando cada axila, qual foi a higiene prévia dos participantes, what was the previous hygiene of the participants. The men were wearing different clothes, tank tops and t-shirts and stuff. Does that compromise ventilation and consequently the odor after the game? What was the criterion used to choose the deodorants? Qual o critério usado por ela para avaliação? So what criteria did you use to evaluate the smell? Foi levado em consideração o uso de outro desodorante before the exercise? And then a quantidade e qualidade do exercício físico foi igual para todos os participantes? These are all good questions. There are actually maybe 100 very good questions, all of which you raised and would affect the results. This doesn't mean that these questions weren't answered already or part of a method, but they're questions that you would raise as a reviewer. So looking at our IMRAD structure here, the method section doesn't stand alone. It ties to the other sections in the paper as well. And I'll show you what I mean. So if you look at these questions again, let's assume that a few of them were in fact accounted for by the deodorant researchers, the guys playing basketball or the people who organized that particular study. These ones in green. Let's assume that these ones in green are questions for which the researchers had answers, and were part of their method. So let's say they knew the ages of the men, and they collected that, they controlled that variable. Let's say they also controlled the variable of time. Let's say they also controlled the variable of the criteria used to choose the deodorants. Let's say they also knew the criteria used by the rater, the judge. And also let's assume that they also knew the quantity and the quality of the exercise. Okay, but none of that was in the method section. So those are questions that you say, okay, those need to go into the method section, right? And so then the method section would look more like this. Men, N equals 4, ages 27 to 39, were chosen for the experiment after playing basketball for 10 minutes. Each man applied a roll-on and spray deodorant, one on each armpit. A young woman was recruited to judge how pleasing the smell of each deodorant was using the same criteria described in Smellerson, 1993. The female judge smelled each armpit for exactly 2 seconds, each time noting her impressions. That's a bit better. It's not good, but at least that tells you more information. It answers those questions. But also remember that the method should also tie back to issues raised in the introduction section. So if the method section has information, some of that information you might expect to be in the introduction. And also, as you recall, I also recommend that you explain not only what you did, but why you did it for it. So with this here, for exactly 2 seconds, the female judge smelled for exactly 2 seconds. That's a fact. But you could also add, to control for intensity, the female judge smelled each armpit for exactly 2 seconds, to say why you did that. And that ties nicely more into the introduction. The introduction could look something like this. There has been alarming decline in birth rates in the world. Alarmistan, 2017. One possible cause is a decline in deodorant use among men. That's, of course, by Ridiculesky, 2018. Much has been published on the effectiveness of deodorants, yet whether it is better to use a spray or roll-on type is still unknown. So that explains the choice. That would, as an example, explain why they've chosen to use roll-on and spray in the method section. Okay, so if those are the questions that you would expect to go into a method section, then what about these other ones that you raised but they didn't have answers for? These here. Let's assume that the researchers did not account for those variables, but they're important ones. Maybe these are questions that could be raised, for example, when an article is submitted and then reviewers ask these questions. What would you do with these? What was the hygiene of the participants? What about the clothes? What about the use of other deodorants? Let's say these variables were not controlled for. Well, that's important because obviously that affects how you can interpret the results. Those could possibly affect or could have an effect on the results. And so it raises questions. Doesn't necessarily make the research bad, but it does affect the results because your results will ultimately be an artifact of the method you use. So if the method then is affecting the results, you need to be able to account for that. Now, remember at the end of last class, I said another way to think of this IMRAD structure is, with the introduction is basically why you're writing about what you're writing about. The method is how you decided to write about that or how you conducted the research. The results would be what your findings are, and then there's the so what. So what about those findings? And so, those questions that I mentioned earlier, I pointed out to you as ones that weren't accounted for. As you'll see today, those questions would need to go into a discussion of how the results could have been affected by not including these things. Remember that among the main reasons articles get rejected, one of them is a poor discussion section. And journals will often say, we need more discussion. But very few people understand what that means. What do you mean, need more discussion? What do you mean? What does a discussion mean? So let me show you an actual example of a rejection. I hope you never see a letter like this, an email like this one. So here is a typical letter from a journal. It says, in view of the criticisms of the reviewers found at the bottom of this letter, and when you receive something like this, it really just, it's like punching you in the stomach. It's terrible, it's heartbreaking. And in view of the criticisms of the reviewers found at the bottom of this letter, we cannot publish your manuscript in the Inglês, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, I left the name of the journal there. In the last years, we have received far more papers than we are able to publish and must make some tough decisions. And if you ever do get a letter like this, don't worry, you're in good company. Everybody receives one. Thank you for considering the Inglês, da, da, da. I hope the outcome of this specific submission will not discourage you from the submission of future manuscripts. Okay, so why was this rejected? I'd like you to read the explanation of why it was rejected by one of the reviewers, and you decide what the reason was. So here is the letter. The manuscript is interesting, and it brings original ideas. However, a major revision is necessary. The methods should be described comprehensively and not confused as it is. Details such as use of water or not to process the mixtures are not mentioned, and this is an important point in this kind of product compositions, mainly due to lime and phase formation. There are not characteristics of the individual components, as the authors mentioned that the materials were characterized. The results should justify the interpretations and conclusions, however, they are just pointed out and not discussed at all. Figures 2, 3, and 4 should be standardized to scale. Sometimes one of the components is namely referring to paper sludge. Sometimes it is namely ETEs, sludge waste, and so on. Language should also be reviewed. Since the manuscript is concerning to technological development, it could present sample image, for example, fracture surface image. Finally, a good, very good revision in the manuscript is necessary. All right. So, as I read that, could you identify the cause of rejection? In fact, if you identified more than one thing, you would be correct. There was not one cause for the rejection. And for most rejection, that is the case. In most cases, there is not one single cause for a rejection. Of course, there are cases like plagiarism. Okay, that will take a paper off the board. Or if the paper is so poorly written in English that the editor receives it and then rejects it without even sending it for review. That's called a desk rejection. But in most cases, it's something more like this. So they highlight, first of all, the method, that the method should be described comprehensively and include more detail. Details such as the use of water or not to process the mixtures are not mentioned. So there's a lack of transparency. There's a lack of detail or sufficient detail for the reviewer to be able to interpret the results. And then they highlight this. The results should justify the interpretations and the conclusions. However, they are just pointed out and not discussed at all. And this is actually a very, very common pitfall that I've noticed that authors make. But the reason they make it is not because they're scared, or mostly it's because they're not sure exactly what to put in there. In the review, they do mention language. Language should also be reviewed. But notice that this is a relatively minor point. If these other things, this part in yellow and this part in pink, if they were good, probably this other part in blue wouldn't have tipped the scale. Probably the editor would have seen if this yellow part and this pink part were okay, the editor would probably say, yeah, this looks like a pretty good article. The reviewers would have given it a higher, and then of course the language part could be fixed. But if those other parts aren't there, or bad as they're pointed out to be here, that tipped the scales against accepting that article. So conceiving IMRAD as introduction, method, result, and discussion, but also why, how, what, and so what, we can see that all of these things connect, but also that some things are trickier to write than others. John Flowerdew has done research on this. He's one of the first people that, back in 1999, did research on this. He wanted to look at, in the context of Hong Kong, what were the trickiest things for non-native speakers to write about? And he found a number of things, including that non-native speakers take longer to write. It takes them more time to write in English. They have less facility of expression. And one of the most important things for this class is the last thing here. He said that he found that introductions and discussions are the most problematic parts of research articles for non-native speakers of English to write. And so what do you think? Why do you think that the discussion section is so challenging for non-native speakers to write? And in any case, what should the discussion section do? What would be the most common ingredients? You would think, well, discussion, you just talk about your results. But here is what some of the researchers say. John Flowerdew points out that within the research article, some parts are found to be more problematic than others. The methodology and result sections are the least problematic, needing only a very conventionalized and formulaic style of writing. But this participant from Hong Kong, he said, the easiest part, I think the methodologies and results sections. My area of research, we are more on the science and engineering papers. More often, the paper format are quite similar with the different research work. So I can use the same style of writing. I just edit them in the same format using my data. That's for the results in the methods section. The most difficult parts, on the other hand, are the introduction, review, and discussion and conclusion sections. These parts are more problematic because they require a persuasive style of writing in which the individual voice of the author needs to come through. Writers have to convince their readers, including editors and reviewers, in these two sections of the importance of their research and the arguments that they are putting forward. So actually there's a number of challenges here. It's not just linguistic, but obviously language comes into play here. But even if you're a Brazilian writing in Portuguese for a Brazilian journal, if your voice, your own authority, think of authorship and authority having the same etymology. If your authority and your voice as an author don't come through, it might have something to do with the fact that you yourself may not fully consider yourself an author yet or an authority yet. You might suffer from what's called imposter syndrome a little bit. The imposter syndrome is, am I really good? Am I really a researcher? And you go through this, a lot of people go through this when they're writing a thesis and a dissertation. Is my study really that good? Is it really valuable? Is this really important? And as a new author, budding researcher, that will come up and it can negatively affect your writing because the method section, the results section, you can write that almost without feeling, it's factual. This is what happened, and this is what I found. It's the how and the what. But the why, the introduction section, and the so what are harder because it involves you trying to put yourself, your voice, in the center of what you're talking about. And if that's difficult for you in a first language, you can imagine that if you're trying to write in English, it might even be harder. So let's talk a little bit about, hopefully by the end of today, you'll have a better understanding of what the most common elements are in the discussion section so that when you get to that section, you don't feel like, okay, now I have to discuss what do I talk about. At least you'll have some guidance, hopefully by the end of today. So I'm going to break the discussion section down into what I've identified as the 6 most common elements of a discussion section. So one of the most common things, and this is often the way the discussion section begins, is the author reiterating or reflecting on again points raised earlier, especially what the author talked about in the introduction section and what was found in the results section. So that's one of the first things that you see in the discussion section. One of the most common things you see is that. Another element that occurs in introduction sections, rather discussion sections that are common in good discussion sections, is the author referring to and comparing her or his study to similar studies in the field or how they relate to what has already happened in the field or been published in the area. And so that's coming back to the introduction in the sense that fitting the author into that dialogue, into that conversation, and the results into the conversation. It's refocusing again on the contribution, not only of what the article makes, but what the findings make to the conversation in that particular area. Another element that's common and important in good, well-written discussion sections is not just recapping or restating your results, but expanding on them, providing some interpretation for them for the reader. And this is one of the hardest things to do, is kind of explaining, expanding and extrapolating on your results. Another common element is talking about the applications or the implications of your data. How do your data have any real-world implications? How can they be used for future research or future real-world problems? Another common element that good discussion sections include is words of caution, talking about what in your research is something that really you should be careful about, or you don't want to overstate their claims about, the limitations of your study, and every study has limitations. We'll talk more about that next week. And finally, the sixth element is how your research forwards the area. How does your study advance research in the discipline that you're working in, and what is still needed? What you've done something, you've contributed, but there's still more to know. And you'll notice that a lot of good discussion sections end this way, talking about what is still needed. All right, so let's look at some practical examples. You read this article already, at least the introduction section. I asked you to read the discussion section also for homework. This is that article about Mexican scientists and the added burden that they have when writing in English. And if you recall, we talked about this in the context of cars, or territory, and move 1 and move 2. And in the move 2, they say, okay, what is still needed, what they really need to know is that the difficulties faced by second language scientists result from disciplinary rather than linguistic problems. And he's talking directly to Swales. Even though he uses this grammar, there have been claims. It sounds like many people have made them, but really the most famous person here, the person that the authors are talking to almost directly, is John Swales, because John Swales said, look, whether you are Brazilian or Italian or Chinese, it doesn't matter. You're going to have difficulty writing about science. As much difficulty as an American who speaks English, a British person who speaks English, and so on, as a native speaker. That's what John Swales' hypothesis was that the burden, the difficulty is the same. But these authors are saying, well, wait a minute, we need to look into this. Is it really the same burden? So this is the introduction. In the discussion, look what they do. Oops. In the discussion, they revisit. Let's look at it together. They say, the purpose of this investigation was to provide quantifiable data through which the perceived burden of writing a research article in English as a second language could be established. Furthermore, the aim of the study was to address the question whether the difficulties in writing an English article in English as a second language were disciplinary or linguistic. So this is simply revisiting points that were raised in the introduction section. Just that. But they carry it forward. They carry on and they expand. And so they say, the data in this study differentiate between disciplinary and linguistic aspects of previously reported difficulties and support the idea that the added burden of second language science writing is linguistic in nature. As the participants in this study responded in parallel questions to the perceived difficulty, anxiety, and dissatisfaction of writing in their first and second languages, differences found related to the factor of their perception of writing in a second language. In other words, as the disciplinary function of writing a science article is consistent between both questions, it is unlikely that this is the factor that contributed to added burden found in the responses of the scientists concerning their second language science writing. So they reported the results, and they say, and this is our claim. Our claim now is because of the results that we found, there is an added burden for Mexican scientists, and this difference cannot be explained solely as a function of the genre itself. Linguistic problems are likely the explaining difference, explanatory difference. They compare to other studies. These findings support the qualitative data supported by other researchers. Difficulties faced by second language scientists, such as those summarized by so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, can be attributed to linguistic difficulty as a result of working in a second language. Qualitative research with non-Anglophone scholars reports greater difficulty in writing quickly, writing appropriately, accessing up-to-date resources, and accessing the networks that facilitate English language publication. And then they talk about the contribution. What the current study does is to assign these difficulties clearly to the linguistic component and specify the self-reported and perceived degree of increased burden while supporting the underlying findings of previous studies that the English science writing involves difficulties. So they talk about these other ingredients that were already talked about in the introduction and how their study compares. And they also talk about, okay, what's different? How does this add to that? And so they carry it further. So how does the study advance the area? So on a different level, this study also deepens our understanding of the affective dimension of science writing. Previous research has addressed this to a limited extent. Sending a manuscript out for review always carries some level of anxiety. All articles are manifestly riddled with emotions and emotional risks because work is received within a context not only of intellectual but also emotional acceptance and rejection. As with other results, the findings of the current study differentiate between disciplinary anxiety and anxiety caused by writing science in a second language. All right. And then they talk about further contribution of this study. And then they talk about the limitations. We're going to talk more about this next week, but notice when they start talking about limitations here, they bring it on. In this case, it followed the discussion of what was still needed and so on. This is strategic. Where you put your limitations is strategic. Because think about if you're going to look for an apartment and you go to visit a house and the owner of the house, the owner of the apartment says, oh, this house is perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. What would you think? Oh, it's too good to be true. When you go to buy a car, for example, if you've ever done that, if it's a used car, one of the first questions someone asks is, why are you selling it? Because you want to know, okay, there must be a problem. There must be a reason for you selling it. What's the problem? So if somebody talks about everything is perfect in their study, it raises the specter of, okay, what's the problem? There's something, this can't be perfect. It can't all be roses. And so they talk about the limitations at this strategic moment. And they say an obvious limitation of the current study is that it focuses on scientists only in Mexico. That's an obvious one, it is. While the population explored in the study does represent a range of scientific fields and scientists, the fact that they come from Mexico and they speak Spanish may have influenced the results. In this sense, the findings are limited to the self-reported and perceived burden of Mexican scientists, and perhaps not to all scientists writing in the second language. Accordingly, it would be very helpful if we had similar data that address scientists from a much wider range of studies. In this sense, that last statement also is what is still needed, this last arrow here. All right, so let's look at the discussion sections that you looked at for homework. I asked you to choose one beyond the one we just looked at. Here's one from the Academy of Management Review. What determines the scope of the firm over time on institutional relatedness? Another one was from the Journal of Autism. Brief report, preliminary evaluation of theory of mind inventory and its relationship to measure of social skills. Another option was this one from the American Journal of Medicine, association between patient-reported medication adherence and anticoagulation control. And another one from Food Chemistry, which is this phenolic composition and in vitro antioxidant capacity. All right. So here, in the discussion section here, you have a discussion and conclusion. We'll talk more about next week if this is a good thing or a bad thing to have a discussion and conclusion together. So let's read this together and you decide what are they doing here of those icons that we saw? What are the articles, what is the author doing? In this article, we have focused on one of the four most fundamental questions in strategic management, The article contributes to our understanding of the scope of the firm question by highlighting the importance of institutional relatedness in an institution-based theory of corporate diversification. Earlier, Peng 2003 articulated how institutional transitions matter for strategic choices in general. We have extended this work by specifying under what specific institutional conditions a conglomeration strategy may or may not add value. Here, you see two things happening, at least two things. One, you have them talking about what Peng did, so they're comparing that, but also how they have extended this work. And then they also talk about this. So clearly, they're doing this. But they're also doing this. How so? Because of this. And that's an interesting strategy. If you can point out a limitation, but also how that limitation also paves a way for future research. It's like a nice way of saying, yes, it is a limitation, but this limitation opens a door for further research. All right, another article was this one here about theory of mind in the context of autism. What are the authors doing here? These findings extend the use of theory of mind as a valuable parent report measure, theory of mind inventory as a valuable parent report measure of theory of mind, TOM. First, they repeat the finding that TOM remains impaired at comparable levels among adolescents with ASDs and is related to verbal and communication ability. Frith et al. 1994. And that ability in theory of mind may increase over time. No ceiling effects were observed. Second, results support the external validity of the theory of mind inventory, demonstrating its valid use in a rural and suburban sample of community recruited adolescents with ASDs. All these things here that they're talking about, they're not reporting statistics. They're now inferring what the statistics told them. So therefore they're extrapolating. They're helping the reader digest their interpretations of the data. And then they also talk about this. Several important limitations of the findings are noteworthy. First, while strict procedures were used to ensure the ASD diagnosis, gold standard research measures were not used, blah, blah, blah. Second, the sample was fairly small, drawn only from a rural and suburban sample and not compared to a normative control. Larger, more geographically diverse samples compared with normative peer data will be crucial to future efforts. So what did they do? They did a limitation, but then that limitation opens a door for future efforts. It's kind of putting a different spin on it. It's the silver lining to the cloud that they inserted. So they say future research will expand upon these promising findings regarding the use of theory of mind, and then they talk about other things that the theory of mind inventory can do for the future research. And then they go on to say this study supports the importance of theory of mind inventory as a valid parent report measure. This is an important step in the advancement of theory of mind research in this population that does not suffer from I mean, look at the adjectives they're using here and how strong the statements are. I'm not saying it's bad. Actually, it's good. That this study supports the importance of the theory of mind inventory, okay? And this is an important step. And they're saying that this study, basically, their study, is an important step in the advancement of theory of mind. So, I mean, if you're a new researcher, if you're an inexperienced researcher, you don't feel a lot of confidence in yourself. To make a statement like this, to say, hey, my study is important, and it advances this, may not feel that comfortable to you. It may not come naturally to you. But it is something that you need to do, in many cases, if you are going to write a journal article with a discussion section. And that's what they do. They interpret the importance of their findings and how it advances the field. Okay. In the American Journal of Medicine, association between patient-reported medication adherence and anticoagulation control, that discussion section there, they start off with a typical, in this prospective study, we found that patient self-reported adherence using 2 quick and simple tools for the assessment of adherence at each patient visit, a VAS, and changes in adherence using 7-day pill recall were independently associated with anticoagulation report. So this is just basically a recap of what they found in a nutshell. But then they continue and they say, our results are consistent with previous studies in human immunodeficiency virus patients and women taking aromatase inhibitors. The only previous study comparing VAS with anticoagulation control in warfarin-treated patients found no association. However, it was a small cross-sectional study using a convenience sample. So they talk about somebody else's limitation here, this study number 15. And say, well, it does compare to this study. Our study compares to this previous study, but the other study was a cross-sectional using a convenience sample, so they do this. That's what they're doing in that paragraph. Okay, and then they say we only found a moderate correlation between 7-day recall and VAS, despite the fact that they were administered in succession. We found that participation reported imperfect adherence more often with the VAS than the 7-day recall, although this might reflect that the tools ask about adherence over different periods of time. It is possible that the VAS is more accurate and less to desirability. Patients can report imperfect range of adherence on a scale without having to report their incoherent or incorrect pill taking directly to a clinician. So what are they doing here? Again, the statistics appeared elsewhere. They're in the results section. But look at this. They're using funny words here. Might. Wow, this is science. How can they use the word might? Isn't might about guessing? You learn this in English, right? May, might, can. You learn this with your English classes when you're first beginning to learn English. You learn it in the context like, tomorrow it might rain, which is, you know, a big guess. You would not expect to turn on the Jornal Nacional and hear the weather reporter say, oh, tomorrow it might rain. You're like, what? Show me the map, you know. Give me some more confidence than that. Show me, is it a 40%, 50%, 60% chance? What? Might sounds so vague, right? So you think, how can an author write here, although this might reflect that the tools, doesn't that sound too vague? No. Actually, the author is being careful. This is the discussion part. Take that. We showed you the statistics. Now we are interpreting what those mean. This might reflect the tools about here. It is possible that the VAS is more accurate. And we're going to talk more about this next week, about what's called hedging. This is what the author is doing here. It's hedging, and it's a very important part of a discussion section, and it's a very important part of this extrapolation. Okay, then the authors go on and they say, these findings are particularly relevant after the introduction of DOACs because anticoagulation management is moving away from specialty anticoagulation clinics that are designed to spend time discussing adherence with patients to general practice clinics. So they're talking about the relevance here, the implications, the clinical applications basically. So that's a real world implication, a real world application. And then they say at the same time, and this here, I think in Portuguese you use similar thing, ao mesmo tempo, in this sense, not meaning simultaneously, you know, in a chronological sense, but as a kind of, you know, let me show you the other side, kind of por otro lado kind of thing. At the same time, poor adherence to DOACs cannot be inferred as it can with warfarin because of the absence of a laboratory test. So they're saying, okay, this has a practical implication, but we need to be careful with it. Sorry, we have a large insect in the room or something. Oh, my phone. they're doing both those things in the same paragraph. With applications, but yes, there are clinical applications, clinical implications, but with a caveat. And then they talk about limitations, actual limitations. They say, well, our study had several limitations. First, we had no objective adherence measurement to validate patient self-reported measurements, although studies have found the VAS to correlate with objective measurements of medication adherence, including electronic monitoring, pill counts, claims-based data. It is possible that patients in our study were more likely to overestimate their adherence owing to recall and social desirability status. So look, obviously they're talking about limitations here because that's the title of it, but look at this word here, possible. It is possible that patients and our participants in our study were more, we're talking about science here. Science, how can they use the word possible? But they are, because they are extrapolating. They're talking about, they're using caution here. And I will argue today, and even more so, more vociferously next week, how this is really, really important. This being able to show caution in the interpretation of your results is really, really important for you to actually not show weakness in your study, but to strengthen the meaningfulness of your study, to strengthen the persuasive, your own persuasive voice. All right. Finally, food chemistry, and talking about the phenolic composition and in vitro antioxidant capacity of 4 commercial phytochemical products. Here, they conflate results and discussion. Next week, we'll talk some more about, is this a good idea? Is it a good idea to put results and discussion together? Sometimes it doesn't matter. Other times I would recommend against it, but we'll talk more about this next week. Should you put these 2 things in the same section or not? But anyway, they divide their results and discussion because of being results and discussion. They have subsections, 3 and then 3.1. So they report the results, but notice what they do. The potent in results and discussion, they say, the potent radical scavenging capacity of allergic acid is not surprising, as this compound has 4 phenolic OH groups with a fused benzofuran structure. Allergic acid has previously shown itself to have strong DPPH radical scavenging capacities or activities. So look, already you see that they're reporting the results, but also they're showing their own emotion, as it were. They're saying, well, it's not surprising. This was expected. And in fact, it's expected, and we've seen this in other studies. So they're comparing. And they go on, they say, allergic acid exhibits minimum solubility in water. However, its solubility increases in organic solvents such as methanol and dimethyl sulfoxide. These authors claim that the allergic acid may act as a good lipophilic antioxidant due to its solubility. So here they're extrapolating, not just reporting results, and comparing in that extrapolation to what other people have done. Same thing here. The antioxidant activity in phenolic hydroxyl compounds in olive leaf extract could be due to the presence of the hydroxyl groups in their structure, such as blah, blah, blah. Previous studies suggested olive leaf. Okay, so here you see another funny word again. You see could be due. It's like might. It's like possibly. But they're interpreting, so they're extrapolating, and they're, again, comparing to other results in studies already published. Then the authors go on and say, in the present study, it is difficult to make general assumptions about structure antioxidant activity relationships with the small number of antioxidant molecules under evaluation. Scavenging data suggests that lutein, sesamol, ellagic acid, and olive leaf extract are capable of scavenging free radicals at physiological pH, hence preventing the limitation and propagation of free radical mediated chain reactions which contribute to oxidative stress. So they talk about a limitation, of course, here. It's difficult to make general assumptions they're limiting, they're using caution. It's not really limitation, they're kind of reining their interpretation in a little bit. Okay, well, you don't want to make too many assumptions here, but this is a possibility, a possible interpretation. So they do those two things at the same time. They say this can be of valuable importance. Here you see the word importance again. Imagine that they have to have some confidence to be able to say that. That shows confidence. This can be of valuable importance in preservation of foodstuffs, drug products, and cosmetics where free radical mediated chain reactions result in lipid oxidation and subsequent deterioration. And so obviously here they're talking about how it can be used in the real world, how it's useful in real world practice. All right, so that gives you a number of examples of the different things, those 6 components that I talked about. Now, if you remember this study, which is not as crazy as the GQ deodorant study, but similar in terms of talking about odor attractiveness, in the results section, they report basically just the statistics and why they conducted those statistics, and the procedure so they talk about the ANOVAs they did, why they decided to run a regression, I think, or some other binomial design instead of the ANOVA that they had done before. And then they simply say figure 2. And there you have in figure 2, that's just result. They show that people who were on a meat diet, those are the white bars here, the ones who were on a meat diet were seen as less, the smell was not so pleasant, the smell was less attractive, and the smell was more intense, according to their research. So if you had a hamburger right before you came here, you're probably smelling very intensely right now. Going back to our IMRAD model then, you could say that that results section is right there. That's the what. Just that. And the so what is this. The results of this study show for the first time that red meat consumption may have a perceivable impact on auxiliary body odor. Odors of donors on the non-meat diet were judged as more pleasant, more attractive, and less intense. This pattern was not influenced by raters' menstrual cycle phase or partnership status. So here you see a number of things. First of all, just fact. You see the what here. You see the results. They say the results show that there may have an impact on auxiliary body odor diet, that according to their data and their statistics, the odor, the smell of the donors on the people who were not eating meat were judged as more pleasant, more attractive, and less intense. And then this pattern, the last sentence, this pattern was not influenced by raters' menstrual cycle. So here you see them going back to the introduction. This is an issue that was raised already in the introduction section, so this is included here. This is the results. What about the first sentence? The result of this study show for the first time that red meat consumption may have a perceivable impact on auxiliary body odor. Is that only results? Is that only fact? Well, actually no. They're also positioning themselves in the research. They're also saying, hey, look at us. We are pioneers. They show for the first time. It's almost like you can see a flashing sign above the research discussion. Look at us, the first time. This is new. Results of the study show for the first time that red meat consumption, so this is more than just recapping. It's more than just simply restating the results. They're saying this is the results and this is why it's important, because it's the first time this has been done. They're reminding the reader of this, which is something that was brought up in the introduction, how this hadn't been done before. So if that's the what, then that is the so what. So you should always be thinking about that connection there. What is the so what about your what? So let's go back to this, this rejection before we saw. And notice that they say the results should justify the interpretations and conclusions. However, they are just pointed out and not discussed at all. All right, so what I'd like you to do is on our webpage, see if it's live. My webpage. I mean, you're the one on SIGA. It's okay, right? It's there? Okay. So on SIGA, rather on Moodle, and also on our class webpage on my website, there's an article called Article for Discussion, Analysis of Discussion. I'd like you to just download that and have a look, just have a look at the discussion section and compare that to what you've seen today. Just download it quickly and have a look just at the discussion section. So on my website, it's right here. Oops. And so you can look at the title and everything if you want. In fact, it's probably a good idea just to get a feel for what it's about. So just take a few minutes and look at section 3, I think it is, here, the results in discussion, and how does it compare? What is perhaps missing, or what could be changed? And do you agree with the journal's assessment of it not being a complete discussion section? So just take a few minutes and read through that. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to, oh, delete, sorry. Yeah. It's on last week's slides. Okay. So, I mean, I can tell you, as somebody who knows English, the English in this article is fine. It certainly wasn't rejected because of any English problems. What did you think about the discussion, considering the 6 elements that we discussed, showed you earlier, about comparing to other studies, talking about limitations, showing, extrapolating, and so on? What did you think about the discussion section, this one? Did you notice any, in the discussion section alone, did you notice any of those things? Those 6 components? You did. Só apresenta, just basically presents. Now, there may be different reasons for that, but I would agree that when you look at the discussion section here, essentially it's almost as if the authors are basically reporting what is already in the tables. So another way of thinking about a good discussion section is, okay, you know, what added value is there to the tables? I mean, could I basically understand what the authors are talking about just by looking at the tables? In this case, almost could. And what is really missing here is basically a critical look at their own data. And when I say critical, I don't mean being criticizing themselves. I don't necessarily mean that. I mean looking at analyzing critically the data that they present. Not just talking about this is what we found, but what could possibly explain the findings? What are some of the things that explain the phenomena that we are reporting? And are there possible other issues that are not being discussed, that are not in the findings? The other issues that could be causing the phenomena that they're reporting, and also, are there other studies that have reported similar things? And if so, how do their studies differ? I mean, there are a couple of studies reported, but it's the same one. I think it's number 11, not much. In the conclusion, so there's all these tables, and then in the conclusion, they do report a couple of things about the implications, the practical applications. But look what they do here. This is another important result is related to the use of composites in civil construction. But they don't say why. So another important result is related to composites in civil construction. Okay, but why? What is it about the results that have implications for civil construction? I mean, it may seem obvious to them. Maybe they wrote and think, I don't want to insult the reader and say, well, they'll be able to infer this information. But no, they should have to add to this to make it clearer for the reader. Okay, what is it about these sludge things that have relevance to civil construction? And there's one word here that I'm going to advise you against using myself, which is this here. The results achieved at the end of the study through physical and chemical analysis proved the possibility to replace natural materials with paper sludge. This is not just me, but it's a pet peeve word with many editors and many reviewers. Do you know why? Because it shows a little bit too much confidence in the data. So it's very difficult to prove definitively anything. And I think maybe this is maybe an issue of something that is commonly used in Portuguese. Esses dados comprovam, I think. It's not a big deal. People write it here. But for non-speakers of Brazilian Portuguese and for English speakers, to read the word and hear the word prove sounds too assertive. Sounds like, what do you mean prove it? It doesn't prove, it shows strong evidence for it. It points to a good possibility of this phenomenon, but prove is just too strong. And so they kind of, to summarize in that section, in the discussion section, they kind of don't do enough of a lot of things, and to some extent they do too much of others. So this is what caused the rejection, in addition to a lot of other issues related to the method. The method wasn't clear, but the discussion section really was mentioned a lot by both reviewers as being problematic. So what I'm going to want you to do for homework now is to take the article you downloaded and analyze it on formative. What exactly is missing? What is present in your opinion? Also remember that you have to complete your feedback within the next 7 days. That's on peer grade. And then after you finish, talk about your experience on formative. And then there's this if time. What this means is if you have time, because everybody always has a lot of extra time, right? If you have time, and this is something that is worth already doing, start thinking ahead now to the rest of your article. You'll be able to do this even better after you receive your feedback. So you'll receive your feedback after the system closes. You'll be able to see what others have written about you, about your work, not about you, about your work. And try outlining the rest of your article. Where do you see your article going from where after the introduction section? How do you see the method section happening, the results section, and then the discussion section? How do you see that shaping up? You don't actually have to write it, but try to see the connection in that IMRAD. Try to think about the why, the how, the what, and the so what already. All right, and that's a wrap. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah.
My question is, when I was writing my introduction, I wasn't trying not to explain too much, because I am supposing that someone from my expertise area will read the introduction.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So when you were saying here that the author wrote muito resumida, né?
Yeah.
So where I have to go, right more or right less?
So first of all, to deal with the first part of your question, when you submit an article to certain journals, sometimes they'll even ask you, who do you recommend to review this article? And you can recommend people. That doesn't necessarily mean that that person will review your article. And there are still several other journals that will not let you decide or even recommend. They'll just send it out for review to people that they think might be good reviewers. However, in most disciplines, in most areas of science, those reviewers, they're doing those reviews out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it for free. That means that since they're not getting paid for it in most cases, when journals send articles out for review, they're expecting people to not answer the email or to just say no. And so their first choice often goes to the second choice and third choice. And when they go to that second choice and third choice and fourth choice and fifth choice, they get farther and farther away from people who may have specific expertise in the area that you're writing about. And so let's say that I receive an article from a journal. Oftentimes the subject matter is only, vaguely related to my specific line of research. And when that happens, I suspect that the people who were the better choices for that article just said no. And that means also that when I read your article, you're going to have to resituate your research for me, because I will not be able to immediately get a lot of things. Also remember that even people who research the same subject as me, the same disciplines as me, they will have often very specific research areas or specific interests that have a whole body of literature that I'm not quite familiar with. So I'll need to know more about it. So if you have a particular instrument that's been used in a particular study, let's say that take this theory of mind inventory. Now, if you're a cognitive scientist, you may be able to read and review that article. But if you don't specialize in autism, for example, and you get a theory of mind, you may roughly know what it means, but you're not familiar with the instrument itself. And so you need to know more about it. It has been validated, who's used it before, and so on. So you have to be careful with that. Yeah, well, and just think when you're writing, okay, am I including enough details here so that there aren't any gaps or holes that between my results and how I got those results? So start with your results. Okay, here are my results, and here are my methods. Okay, is there any question mark that can be raised between, okay, how did you get this? Why are you, and then also goes with the discussion. When you discuss your results, okay, why are you so confident that this is the case? What is it in your method that says that that gives you the liberty to say this is I can confidently say this is true? And that will depend on a lot of things. So how your sample size, the extent to which a particular method has already been used a lot and been shown to work, all kinds of stuff. You're welcome. Is that it? That's a wrap. All righty. Oh, yeah. No problem.
Pessoal, não esqueçam, tá? Hoje é o último dia para cancelar a disciplina. E quem tiver dúvidas, por favor, consulte este site aqui. Tá? É PRPPG.ufr.br. Opa! PRPPG, certo? Barra site, barra perguntas, frequência, barra 2, tá? Então, ó, pessoal, qualquer dúvida, vocês podem entrar no site da PRPPG para tirar dúvida, tá? O aluno tem um jeito para cancelar a disciplina e o professor tem outro jeito para cancelar a disciplina, tá? Então, vou pedir que vocês entrem no site da PRPPG. Podem buscar no Google, perguntas frequentes da PRPPG, transversal, vocês vão cair na disciplina, tá? Cada tipo de aluno tem uma forma de cancelar a disciplina, tá bom? Hoje é o último dia, amanhã não tem mais como, aí vai ter que levar a disciplina, tá bom? Pessoal, é isso, muito obrigada. See you next week. Acho que tá bom.